shady, self-serving deals. Senate Leadership Fund is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Had enough of the partisan bickering? We've all seen the ads, but here's the truth. Brian Fitzpatrick grew up in this home in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. How do I know? He's my brother. And I can tell you that he's not about solving problems as a Republican or a Democrat. He's about solving problems as an American. And that's why we need my brother, Brian Fitzpatrick, in Congress.
I'm Brian Fitzpatrick, and I approve this message.
We're here with Benedict Cumberbatch, the best name ever. Just say it. Benedict Cumberbatch. You can say it over and over again. Whose new Marvel movie, Doctor Strange, already blowing away box offices overseas. He plays a neurosurgeon who becomes one of the most powerful superheroes in the world, and you get more than...
And yeah, good day to you. Sorry for the long intro there, but I wanted to start class today with looking at media content. And we were just looking at media content on the TV screen. And what would it be like if you could dive into that TV screen and go beyond what we're seeing to discover all of the elements that come to play that end up delivering content like we just saw? Advertisements for political candidates, which we saw there, very stark, strong, vivid advertisements, followed by a morning show, Live with Kelly, with a guest host today on ABC. This show is being watched by millions of, I have to say, mostly females in American households across the United States right now. So if we were to dive into that TV set and go beyond the content, what would we discover? Well, in a way, that's what we've been doing in this class, but we've started with the elements at the front end in terms of the book and the way that we've been handling our lectures. So we've started with financing and regulation and all the other ones that we've taken a look at, and now we arrive finally at media content. So we will be spending, since content has such a big prominence in a media system, we will be spending 2 classes on this in terms of instructor video lectures. And this is the first one today, and what we'll be handling will be the 4 first countries that are talked about in this chapter on media content. The 3 European countries, Sweden, France, the UK, and the United States. We're going to break that apart for today's video lecture. And then the next video lecture on Thursday is going to handle the next 4 countries. I also want to say if you have your book handy today, that would be helpful. You can pause the video for a sec and grab it, because we are going to take a look at 2 particular photos/images in the book. So let me finally say before we get going here that I am going to break up the material differently than I've done in other instructor video lectures. For this class today, I want to kind of talk about themes as a get-go, and they're not going to follow the order of the themes in the chapter. It's a way of me refreshing my thinking and presenting material to you that has also been taken to a new level beyond when I wrote the book. And I also am kind of experimenting with it to see if this is a good way to teach the chapter. So just to let you know about that. To start with, though, we do want to make sure that there is a definition that I try to get across about what content means. I try to get that across in this chapter. I'm not sure that I really made a good choice in trying to make that distinction, but the old way that content was informed was not helpful. It was informed by a division between form and content. Form and content equal content. That just doesn't make sense semantically. So I tried to redefine content as being form plus substance, whereas form is the way that information is delivered. On television, it's through both video and audio. On radio, obviously, it's just audio, so that's the form of the way that those mass media deliver their content. Form is one component. The other component is substance, which is the information that comes out of that delivered stuff that you get from your radio and TV receivers and your newspapers and your websites. It's the information, it's the quotes, it's the statistics, it's the explanations, it's the opinions. And if you think of content that way, I think, at least when I wrote this chapter, that was the way that I thought you could get at a cleaner understanding of truly what media content is. Okay, that aside now, let's go on to the themes of content that we can kind of categorize countries into similar attributes by. So the first one is nudity and profanity. and sexuality in its general sense. We can say that all of these in the European countries are very, very similar. There are some small differences. In France, Sweden, and England, in the newspapers, you will see a topless page 3 girl. Page 3 is as known in Britain in a newspaper that's actually published by the News Corporation, that big conglomerate which owns Fox in the United States. And this newspaper in England is called The Sun. It actually has the largest circulation. It's a tabloid, and if you look on in your textbook on page 204, you will see this photograph of a topless female. I had to pay about $750, by the way, for that, just to give you the insides of writing a book, for the royalties that were associated both with the modeling agency and also with the newspaper itself. And when I made the purchase, I was in a London dormitory at a university. The courier for the newspaper brought me the signed contract. It was a very exciting moment as a young author who had to get many copyright clearances for virtually anything you see in this book, photograph or graphic-wise. At any rate, this is a very standard feature. You even see elderly citizens reading this newspaper with it wide open on the train, and nobody bats an eye. It's in part another indication of how nudity is treated as something that is natural, and the human body is not something to be shirked from. It's something not necessarily to be flaunted, but it certainly isn't something to be portrayed as unnatural. So you've got that going on in the English newspapers. In France, we know that those newspapers are very, very classical, very formalistic. They're very technical. They're inventing new knowledge all the time, very small audience, and they don't do that kind of stuff. In Sweden, in their tabloids, you generally don't have nudity either. You do have sensational stories in the tabloids in Sweden, stories about corruption and drug busts and scandals, but you don't have nudity, profanity, etc. When it comes over to radio and TV, though, that's where they're all very similar. You can hear plenty of American music on radio for both the public radio stations, by the way, and the commercial radio stations, which is to say the BBC stations plus the Virgin radio stations. If you've read the chapter, you know that Virgin is an English or a British commercial network, same as the Virgin Company. And both of these will play songs that have profanity. You will hear, for example, a fuck on the air. You'll hear that in Sweden, you'll hear that in England, you'll hear that in France on the radio. It's just, the view is that if you're going to hear that in public when you're out and about, if you're behind somebody going to a grocery store and they're in a traffic jam and somebody cuts them off, that person is going to yell an obscenity a lot of times. And if that's happening in real life, then why shouldn't radio reflect that? That's the sort of view in Europe. On television, similar kind of thing. You can have nudity almost every single night, if not every night, in all three countries on television channels, both the public stations. It's not as if the public ones have more of a puritanical view towards nudity just because they're public. In Britain and France and Sweden, no, nudity, the general theme, according to the codes by which stations are licensed, says that if the nudity is not gratuitous, if it fits in with the context and the content, if it's part of the storyline of two people making love, or a person getting into a shower after they've been chilly, or something that makes sense to the plot, it's okay. And that includes sexuality too. You won't have close-ups, you won't have penetration, those other kinds of technical terms that we've talked about, but you will have people embracing, you will have people grasping, you will have people kissing passionately. This is very, very common. Of course, in the United States, we know that that is not the case. We know most of the rules in this country are very restrictive when it comes to profanity, nudity, to the extent that a radio station, even an individual disc jockey or an individual television reporter can be fined by the FCC for violating those rules. All right, moving to the next theme now. It's the theme of violence. In violence in the European countries, we tend to see it a little bit of a difference between Sweden and England. England, there's no real restrictions on violence. France and Sweden have some similarities, but Sweden is really the country that tries to protect the most against violence on television, even having banned some movies like Casino from coming into the country. I don't know if it's still as bad, but generally the society reacts strongly to violence, especially fictional violence, violence in dramas and films. The country has a hard time accepting human behavior that acts like that. France also has those rules when it comes to television. They actually have descriptions in their regulations that say no sounds of bones crunching and blood spurting from bodies. They actually have this kind of codification in the French regulations that say none of that on TV. As you know, America is very, very loose with depicting violence in fictional settings. Law and Order, the CSI series, your average cop drama, any medical show. We don't have really a problem with that. We're very sort of visually accepting of things that depict violence in a fictional setting. When you get to news, though, it's flipped between Europe and the United States. In news, we want our news to be cleaner. If you ever really see war reporting in another country like a Britain or France, you're like, oh my God, war is I knew it was bad, but it's much worse than I thought, because I'm really seeing reporters running through burned out buildings and shaky cameras, and I'm seeing people with limbs missing. And that's because news reporting in Europe, including these three countries, is more accepted to be graphically accurate of what's happening in the war, to actually depict the war as it's happening, as distasteful and as hard to look at as that is. Whereas in the United States, some have said it's because people watch TV at dinner time, and American families don't want that kind of stuff on at dinner. I mean, there's some truth to that, I believe, but also just America has a different view towards its news. We kind of want our news cleaned up. We want it to come into as not too disturbing, especially from other countries. When it comes to politics, this is another theme I want to talk about. It's not talked about in the book as its own specific theme. But when it comes to politics, you do find that in the European countries, their newspapers are more political, generally speaking. You do have most newspapers striving towards an overall ideal of objectivity, as opposed to being biased, being in favor of a candidate, being in favor of a party, being in favor of a movement. But at the same time, you have papers that are either slightly left, slightly right, slightly left, slightly right. The Mirror in Britain is slightly left. The Times is slightly right. Okay, we don't talk about USA Today. We do talk about the Washington Post as being that. We do talk about the LA Times as being that, but we have a more narrow view of where a newspaper should be in terms of objectivity. In Britain, Sweden, you have newspapers that are aligned with political parties, and in France, you have a very political press. You have a communist newspaper. You have a right-wing newspaper, El Fig, as it's fondly known, but Le Fig, or Le Figaro. It's a very pro-war, pro-military right-wing newspaper. And then you have L'Humanité, which is a very communist newspaper, very much working people's rights newspaper. So politics is treated very differently in newspapers. On radio and TV, politics is mostly left to objective discussion programs. You don't have radio and TV politicizing on one particular viewpoint of a political party or a candidate. And the next thing that I want to talk about now is kind of straying away from the idea of social themes. It's away from the idea of content themes, and it's talking about radio formats. Radio formats is something that was invented in the United States. The whole idea of having a format that is very, very narrow in terms of its content. It's not going to play big band music and then Frank Sinatra and then the B-52s and then somebody from today. That's silly. I should have somebody from today. I guess we'll just say. I would just say Ed Sheeran. My son's listening to a lot of Ed Sheeran. You're not going to have a station that's going to be playing that many different genres of music in the average American radio market. Only college radio really does that. That's because the idea of a format was invented so that you can have rock and roll, or you can have hits, or you can have modern country music, or you can have alternative music and go for a very specific audience, age-wise, demographic-wise. It also makes that station a little bit easier to program because the content is so clear about what has to fit into that mold. I'm mentioning this because the idea of a radio format has been exported by the United States to other countries. We will see this when we get to the chapter on imports and exports. But it's been exported to Sweden, France, and the UK in terms of their commercial radio programming. So their commercial radio programming kind of mimics the US programming in terms of a radio format, lots of ads, etc. But then these countries also have lots of radio programs on the public side that are vastly different. And if you go to page 205 in the book, you will see the BBC's radio offerings for three of their channels. They actually have channels, radio channels. You can get them anywhere in the country. That's what a channel means. 3 BBC radio channels. BBC Radio 1 lists the disc jockeys or the on-air hosts. And then BBC Radio 2 lists the kinds of programming that it offers. It's more highbrow, Whereas BBC Radio 1 is hits, pop hits music. BBC Radio 2 does interviews, it does documentaries, it does theater, but it's not necessarily completely elite in its documentaries. They've got a documentary here on Rod Stewart. Rod Stewart, a pop singer, but they do a full-fledged documentary on him. BBC Radio 3 is similar as well to the other two in that it has its own content area that distinguishes it from the others, and this one is a highbrow when it's going to do orchestras. It's got Composer of the Week. Bellini is one of the featured programs at 9 o'clock. So these are TV listings, and we don't use that at all in the United States to go to a program guide for what radio listings are. It kind of shows a different kind of listening that goes on. And also what you might notice is that the times of some of these programs are not always at the top of the hour and the bottom of the hour. So that's another feature that I want to mention that comes out in this chapter on content, is in the U.S., we live by the top of the hour and the bottom of the hour when it comes to radio and TV programs. Everything starts at 6 o'clock and ends at 6:30, or starts at 6 and ends at 8 or 7. It's always the top of the bottom of the hour. Why is that? In part, it's because of the FCC regulation that says that you have to do your call letters by law at the top of the hour. WESS 90.3 FM, East Stroudsburg University, East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. Have to do that by law. Same for TV, you have to do it visually. So everything starts at the top of the hour, but also it's because advertising drives the structuring of the content. We know that 22 minutes is the average length of a program in radio or TV during prime time. And radio and TV during prime time then is only left with 22 minutes of its own content, because 18 minutes is going towards advertising. So in order to structure that, advertisers make buys within half-hour segments. And that's why we have a situation where programming is always around the clock, which then guides your life. Your life is geared in half-hour increments. Your life is geared towards, if you're going to engage in media, being there at the top or the bottom, but not in between. Radio in Britain, Sweden, France, etc. starts and ends at different times, as does television stations. So in a way, it kind of makes you a very loyal viewer or listener to the particular program that you choose, because if you choose that program and you don't like it after 5 minutes, you don't have many options to change over to, because other programs are already well underway or are at the very end, etc. They're not starting at the same time. So it kind of, in a way, forces you to stick with that program and give it a better chance than if your patience had just run out quickly. All right, the last two things that I want to talk about for today. One is that advertising is restricted in the European countries on their public stations. They're not allowed at all on the BBC programs. They're not allowed at all on the Swedish public broadcasting programs. Over on the side for France, though, as we've noted earlier, you can have half advertising and half funding coming from the license fees. So therefore, public broadcasters do air advertising, although the advertising is curtailed according to minutage limits. Okay, so there's restricted advertising. In the U.S., we can say that advertising is kind of restricted on radio and TV, not by any law, but by the marketplace, and it's sort of like the public won't tolerate more advertising than 22 minutes per half an hour. That has yet to be seen. We do have the infomercial, right? That's the only thing that maybe distinguishes American TV from all the other kinds of TV out there, is we have the infomercial, an entire half hour or hour of programming. But in terms of the public tolerating advertising like they do in a Cosmopolitan magazine or a Vanity magazine, where the first 20 pages are advertising before you actually get to the table of contents, 20 pages of advertising. We don't quite have that kind of tolerance in television and radio. It seems to be about 22 minutes, 18 minutes, that's about all we'll tolerate. All right, the last item that I want to mention is, because of the license fee that we noted earlier that operates in Britain and in Sweden and in France, there is this pool of money that is used by the government to supply those public networks that are set up, those public channels that are set up, those public TV producers that are set up to provide programming that wouldn't otherwise be provided by the commercial marketplace. And so this programming has to have a kind of a meaning to it that's beyond just making money or being profitable. That's why I mentioned the Alexander the Great documentary from Britain and at the BBC produced, where they recreated Alexander the Great walking all the way across the Mediterranean to show what it was like for this great military general to have done what he
to have accomplished what he accomplished. And that is where my last point leads for today. It is the documentary. Because of the license fee, you have a lot more documentaries being done in France, Sweden, and the UK than you do in the United States. And really professional documentaries taking years to produce, and really interesting documentaries, not just about history, not just about nature, not just about government. I've seen documentaries, for example, that examine how two people met in college and then ended up in mountains of debt in their early 20s. Mountains of debt, over hundreds of thousands of dollars through their credit cards, through loans, through mortgages, through bad business investments. And this documentary followed them through that 2 years. I mean, it's an amazing cost associated with that. Taking two people through 2 years, developing that level of comfort, and then putting together something that's so ordinary, it happens to ordinary people, but is so interesting as well. That's the kind of programming that you do get in European countries. Not that we don't have that increasingly in the United States. We do have some excellent documentaries on bands, for example, music artists, historical figures for sure. We do have increasing reality programming. Anthony Bourdain, et cetera, going to other countries and doing documentary style reporting. But this particular documentary, they're really nicely produced professionally, really long time to make documentary. That's a uniquely European thing because of the license fees. Okay, that's going to finish up content. I hope that I've given you some things to think about. Have a great day.